Hello, and welcome to the So Emotional podcast. Here on the cast, we discuss everything emotions through the lens of attachment, the nervous system, and internal parts work. We're a little irreverent and like to have fun exploring the emotional issues and dynamics that interest us. So come along and hang out. Let's explore the fascinating lands of emotions.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the So Emotional podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Angela Wetzel. I'm the founder of Epic Initiator Coaching. I'm a trauma-informed life and relationship coach. And this here is Nick Carl.
That's me.
He is the founder of Safe Anchor, or the Safe Anchor.
Founder.
And yes, founding member.
Founding anchor.
And an experienced somatic experiencer.
Much experience.
And a friend of mine.
Oh,
Yeah.
new to the roster.
A friend.
What's on the agenda today?
Today we're gonna talk about boundaries because it's like, I don't know, it's like in the ethers, it's all around. It just seems like it's very timely. It's interesting. I find it interesting when I have like random things sent to me, and then there's also like a lot of themes around boundaries coming up that I'm like, it's time to talk about boundaries.
Right. Okay, so in this podcast, we talk about emotions, right?
Oh yeah, I forgot to say, yes, we remove the stigma and enigma around emotions, and really this is to help everyone on the emotional journey.
Right. Well, and I think it's a underexplored, under-discussed topic of like understanding, right?
Yeah, really understanding emotions and like what the language of emotions are. I'm learning how to discern their meaning because they're an entirely different language other than like words or that of the conscious mind. Like it's energy that we're interpreting.
So we discussed attachment styles. So this is different styles of bonding, right? About how we bond with other people. And the big attachment styles are secure, anxious, and avoidant, and different flavors and mixtures of all those things, right?
Yeah.
Part of those, the constituent parts of these, I just think that the topic today of boundaries, it's like, well, in bonds, right? In bonds and our bonding between, friends or siblings or parents, everybody, and inside of ourselves, that boundaries consist of lots of different parts, the boundaries of like what is mine, what belongs to me, and what belongs to you, and how those things interact, right?
Right.
And I think the goal of talking about boundaries and trying to explore them and understand them more is try to gain more discernment about, mostly it's like what belongs to who, right? And then once, because it's like surprise, it's like there's plenty of things that belongs to ourselves, and when we start to explore those things, then it's like it comes into this whole spectrum of powerlessness or empowerment, right? Victim or power, right? And trying to explore and forge and understand the world of the things that actually belong to you, and then about how to take responsibility for those things. The how is like a whole, that's like all the work of it. But starting to understand what the boundary is, what boundaries are, and then sort of like how that's connected to you, and that can be in your wheelhouse, and then when it's not. So
yeah.
I
was going to say we kind of covered some of this in I think it was our last podcast. Right. About like sexual boundaries, because we covered consent there because it's a really important topic. And so we did cover it a little bit there, but I think it'll be important to kind of talk about the intersection of insecure attachment styles. So anxious, avoidant, disorganized, fearful, avoidant, those styles, and codependence, and how complex trauma and those attachment, like how it all kind of goes together. And so if you struggle with any form of insecure attachment, anything other than secure, pretty much when you're predominantly there feeling not secure in relationships or not secure within yourself, just, learning how all that ties in together and how to make sense of it, essentially. So I think it's a big topic.
So, okay, I like that. Like go through the big, I guess the big three or the big four of attachment styles, and then what are like, because I think we got to kind of stay a little bit high on the view here, right?
I don't know what you mean by that, but I like the metaphor.
I just mean from like a little bit of a higher perspective, because we can really get.
Yeah, we can go into like the nitty gritty, but yeah, like to kind of keep it a little more general.
So with attachment styles and then boundaries, let's just kind of roll through each and what are some of the boundary troubles that each sort of presents.
Yeah. So any style that's like insecure, like the insecure attachment usually comes from some form of trauma or complex trauma. Oftentimes it's complex.
Yes.
So that just means like consistent boundary violations, needs not being met, just different types of relational trauma, feeling traumatized, victimized inside of relationships, or because you were abandoned or rejected, and feeling very afraid and victimized outside of relationships because no one was there.
Right.
And so from there, it's like boundaries and trauma, like boundary issues around trauma are really big because the trauma is usually occurring. So trauma isn't the actual incident, it's what happens inside of you because of that incident. And like Dr. Gabor Mate describes it that way. And I think he does so really well. Like it's a great definition to understand, because I think he said this, he said, if it was that thing that happened outside of us, we would have absolutely no control over it whatsoever.
Right.
So being that it's the result of what happens is what happens inside of us, that trauma, then we do have, a snowball's chance in hell of, well, no, that sounds like I'm saying it's not possible. So we can heal it as opposed to not being able to heal it.
Yeah, we can't unlearn it. So I listened to a little bit of Joe Rogan had Gabor Mate on today because he released a book today. Okay, and they were just getting into the fundamentals of this, which is exactly where we are right now. Okay, which is what being traumatized is. So he described in like indigenous cultures, the whole tribe raises the child. The child doesn't hit the ground, doesn't even touch the ground, is held and fed constantly for like the first 2 or 3 or 4 years, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in like modern parenting styles, which I think is finally going away, which I forget the guy's name.
The Dr. Spock thing?
Dr. Spock thing, which is like babies, like the tyranny of the child. So when the baby cries, you just need to leave them alone, and also
don't
sort of
let them manipulate you, because they will
right.
take over.
And the isolation of sort of motherhood as it stands now. It's like, okay, you're a mother on and unto yourself, it's like you have to deal with the child by yourself, which can be extremely overwhelming. And that's just like if you have one child, think about it, 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever the number was,
Right.
So just the basics of how a child needs to be responded to, which is like attunement, like affection, care, like constantly.
Emotional regulation
Constantly, all the time, right? And in the absence of that, that's where, a child's nervous system or their brain, they can pattern in like when it's not on the outside, it's on the inside, that they're sort of like stressed out over and over and over and over. And these are the formations of trauma, right? Yeah. This is what complex trauma is. Yeah. Okay, so that's how trauma's made. So what are we talking about?
The attachment styles and just
insecure attachment.
Yeah, so just for the basic attachment styles and just kind of a precursory, like maybe boundary troubles that they may come into. And what I see with anxious attachment is, so their default setting is going to be to pursue to get love, right? So it's more of that like love addict, which means they're really looking for love and security and safety outside of themselves. So it's like, if they're okay, I'm okay. But also I need someone else to be okay. I can't do it on my own. I can't do this, right? And that person will often bypass other people's emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, and some examples, like just to be more specific, they may not necessarily care how the other person feels, just as long as they're able to get into that space and feel a sense of closeness, right? So maybe missing some cues
Right.
and needing that attachment and security so much that that's all they're focused on, and
Right.
they can be missing like what's going on with the other person.
Yeah,
And
so
like,
they're dysregulated. They're not seeing what's actually in front of them because of the traumatic habitual response inside them is driving them past these.
right. So if another person expresses a boundary with them, like, and states a need for space, that can really feel like abandonment and
Right.
rejection.
Right.
And then that triggers that same abandonment rejection wound.
Right.
But it's the very thing that can also get them rejected, because instead of self-soothing and going within and like learning those skills of self-regulation, they will always prefer other regulation, regulate, like co-regulating. They'll always prefer that, but they may be pulling on other people's resources in a way that they don't, want to be
Right.
engaged with. And then it causes that like self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's like, we see this in nature a little bit, like with animals. Like if there's an animal that needs to take up a lot of resources because it's like ill or injured, in terms of survival, like it's the same with humans. Like we have our own internal, emotional, physical resources, and our time and energy is valuable to us. So it can really cause like a sense of dismell, which I forget who that was coined by, but it's kind of like a, ooh, gross, right? So when you have
Right.
something that feels weak needing to hold on to you,
Right.
it's very common for people to be turned off by that level of anxiety or neediness. And often that anxious person is also self-rejecting because they don't like it either. And well, it kind of depends on how disorganized their personality is, right?
Sure. Sure. Sure.
But usually they're self-rejecting. Something else that may happen is like violating physical or personal boundaries, like going through phones, finding evidence,
Right. Right.
trying to think of some other common ones.
What I'm sort of sensing here is that the trauma in one person, it because I think about a relationship as sort of like a dance. It's like two things coming together, getting closer and sharing a lot. But when one person is shaky and looking for like, I need to like lean on you for all these things, it can throw this other person who might be secure or might have their own sort of like matrices of, but it starts to get everything
Yeah.
out of
Like I
whack.
like I mean, I can go into this a little bit, but I have some like basic red light, green light, yellow light rules for engaging with other people's nervous systems. And I would say that if both of you are good to go, like you're both in a regulated state, then like hang out, talk, like have the tough conversation, like
Right.
do the things, right? Great, go. If you have one person that's green, that's good. So they're in like a ventral, well regulated state. You have another person that's in like a yellow state. They're kind of could be somewhat dysregulated.
Sure.
If that person that's in the green is able to stay in that regulated state and support them, then it's like it's a go.
Right.
The same, and it's the same if you have someone in that green state, and then you have someone in a very dysregulated state, like a red, like very dorsal shut down, very reactive. It can still be go as long as it's like safe. If that person can stay regulated and grounded, then they can usually carry that. But it can be a burden for one person to always be the regulated person if
Sure.
it's not,
Absolutely.
kind of shared.
Right.
But in any case, if you have one person that's yellow and the other person's red, it's like no go. And if you have a red and a red, it's like don't engage, right?
Right.
So it's really about recognizing what state you're in. And this would kind of go along with like polyvagal theory, but sort of knowing what state you're in before you're engaging with other people. And it's really important to know when you're blended, or this is an internal family systems. It's like being blended with a wounded part that isn't. I feel like I'm overcomplicating this.
Yeah, well, it's like
good to know when you're triggered is basically
yeah.
what I'm saying. When you have a trigger or your trauma is running the show, it's going to color your perspective.
Right. It's like you don't try to like have a negotiation when you're, redlining crazy, like angry, any emotion, right? And like to think about it in the way that, like, Esther Hicks puts it, so it's like, are you coming from a place of like creativity? And like think about actually being creative. It's like you got to be pretty relaxed and like a pretty like
Yeah.
exploratory sort of like almost joyous place to explore things, and kind of
Hmm.
not taking life too seriously, and just seeing like what you could create. Are you coming from that place, or are you coming from I'm triggered, I'm
I'm
collapsed,
fearful. Yeah.
I'm
I'm
fearful,
fearful.
I'm angry, I'm hungry,
I'm ready to fight, flee. I'm ready to, like, I feel like I need to fawn or
Sure,
overcompensate so someone doesn't get angry. Like,
right,
anytime you feel like you really need to like do something like, a major shift in order to be okay, then
right.
you're not feeling good.
But like in that
You're
example that
likely
you gave
triggered.
before, we sort of talked about a person who is anxious, and so one of their typical patterns is to go outward, kind of across their boundaries. So I don't know if it's boundary violating or whatever it is. Like they just
I
have
mean, it
poor.
can be. So, like, if a person, let's say that like partner has requested space, or maybe they didn't even request space, but they're off doing their own thing.
Right,
The anxious person who's like fully and they're anxious and needing that co-regulation, like, may show up to work, like they may
right,
call them a million times,
right,
right? So it's just like this consistent reaching out to try to these bids for connection that
right,
can increase in intensity when that response hasn't been met because they're not they don't trust themselves to be able to self-soothe in that moment. Like,
right,
in that moment, if you're fully blended and fully triggered and you have no capacity to like observe the fact that you're triggered, then you are fully alone in it. And it can
mm,
be utter hell if you're very
right,
anxious to feel completely powerless.
right.
Those are very difficult feelings.
So is it a dynamic of boundaries that violation of a boundary, does it necessarily have to come with some sort of trigger? Because if you're not triggered,
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think that a person can unconsciously bypass another person's boundary without being aware of it, especially if those boundaries haven't been communicated. For one, because sometimes when we're aware of our own boundaries or what we need, like personal space or whatever, if you're able to know that and articulate it ahead of time, then you might share that with someone that would be proactive. But in the moment, if you start to feel anger or resentment, or you start to notice like you need to run, or you're just not feeling comfortable or safe, and you start to notice the trigger, then there's something that your nervous system needs.
I kind of mean the other direction, not coming in from you, but I mean you being the progenitor of like breaking your own or violating somebody else's boundaries.
Wait, say that again.
So I mean of an individual person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about what's coming in at me. I'm talking about what is, because when I imagine somebody who's anxious, that there's a lot of outgoing energy all the time, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of boundary breaking happening. I don't know. I'm thinking like a directionality, but it almost feels like,
Well,
because I feel
I
anxious
think,
people want to get closer, right? So there's always
mhm,
this move to get closer,
yeah,
get in, lean in, do this thing, but
right.
there's always a movement towards something.
Mm-hmm.
Starting off with the thing that kicks it off, which is a trigger. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine if let's just take this anxious person, we take away all triggers, are they then secure? Is that what it is?
If a person doesn't have any triggers, then they don't really have like any, like, they've healed probably all their trauma.
Okay.
And so
I think it is. So it's
I
like so.
guess, yeah, I guess it would be like a
Okay.
secure person because they're not experiencing that. But that's like so hypothetical. Like, I don't know if I believe like massive healing can happen, but I don't know if people are like perfectly secure. I think when I think of secure attachment, like, I'll put it this way: if a person is predominantly insecure attachment, meaning they feel like an easy flow of reciprocity and love, like giving and taking, being in proximity feels safe, and being
Secure.
alone.
You're talking secure.
Yeah, I'm talking secure. It feels safe.
Yes.
So there's a lot less relational triggers, and most trauma is relational. it happens because of relationships or because of the void of relationships.
Okay. So, I think this is interesting to talk about somebody secure, right? Let's talk.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
about what is somebody secure? Because they still have boundaries too, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. So it's kind of about knowing your own limits or your own values or standards or like what you would like.
Mm-hmm.
So as a secure person, like they would feel very free to express those boundaries and a lot more likely to be able to hear and understand that someone else's boundaries don't mean anything. Like it's not an affront to someone else. If I have
Right.
boundaries and you're secure, you'll be like, I hear that. Like that's a boundary.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Okay.
respect that because there's nothing like I need to do to like get from you necessarily. Like I feel okay in closeness and I feel okay when I'm like far away. So it's like there's kind of an internal sense of safety and your nervous system being able to regulate itself inside and outside of relationships. So there's not a lot of reactionary energy or,
Right.
things happening. And there's not a lot of like repressive activity where it's like you're feeling just victimized
And I think that
repeatedly.
for the secure person, it probably gives them the most opportunity that there is to respond consciously, right? Because if you're
Yeah.
secure, then it's like it doesn't matter where you are in proximity to this person, who you
Mm-hmm.
are maybe even bonded with,
Right.
closely, that you in and of yourself are happy and safe and
Right.
mostly good and
Right.
okay. Whereas somebody who with an insecure attachment, most of that drive, right? Most of those triggers are unconscious,
They can be largely unconscious, yes.
right? So
And it
and
can
then
just be
like,
things that are happening. It's just
right.
happening.
So of just like trying to do your best to use your brain, any kind of conscious brain that we could bring to bear with boundaries, respecting them, knowing sort of what they are, enacting them, or just being aware of that. It's trickier when you are unconscious and
Totally.
living in a wound. Yeah, for sure.
Totally. Because you're in the emotional parts of your brain. It's more of like, I think in the amygdala and like, um, but in order to have free will, like we actually have to have some form of consciousness or like be
Hmm.
in the prefrontal cortex, like that seat of higher awareness.
Right.
So if you're not there, if you're dysregulated, your prefrontal cortex is like going to go offline. So
Right.
it's about using like your consciousness to try to like bring that back online and like
Right.
hold the impulses like to bring yourself back into the present
Right.
moment, which can be really challenging. And like that's
Yeah.
a practice, like that is a practice of self-regulation to
Right.
stay to notice like, oh, I'm triggered. It's like the moment you notice, it's like now you're getting into that free will territory where you actually have a choice about how to do things.
Sure.
But when your nervous system is dysregulated, it's really challenging because you have these instinctive drives
Yeah.
to just find safety. And
Yeah.
that's going to be these very strong cues to run or fight
Right.
or, and that can show up a lot of different ways. That can show
Right.
up as like serious anger and like wanting to punch someone in the
Right.
face or like manipulate or to
Right.
plead your case or to, um,
Well, that and I think when you are fully triggered, right, then you are just reverting back to the old stuff, right? These are the
mhm.
old tried and true patterns. And though the tried and true patterns might throw up a certain set of boundaries, right, they're not responsive to actually what's happening in the present. So it's just like it's just a reset back into that, and then everything is seen through the lens of this old thing, and then it's just like, you just run the same race over and over again, you're just
Yeah, because those parts, that trauma can cause like holding patterns in the body where your unconscious, like decided that, I don't know, maybe in order to stay safe, like if you look into some of Dr. Sarno's work, which is really fascinating. I'm trying to think of the name of the book right now. I
yeah,
think it's
it's
called the
about that.
divided. I think it's called the Divided Mind. It's
Mm.
a really good book about kind of understanding the power of the nervous system. So I remember being at one of Mass and Kip's events. This was in 2019, but one of my friends there, she got very triggered during one of the exercises, and she went numb from her elbows down and her knees down. So her nervous system decided that in that moment, whatever was
Right.
happening was very triggering for her. It decided to immobilize her so that she couldn't fight back, because that was the nervous system response that had kept her safe then.
Yeah.
It also meant that she had a really hard time asking for help. So she went to the back to say, I'm having a response, and
Right.
really had a hard time like saying what she needed or following through. And they said, oh, someone will meet you. But I think she said she ended up waiting, and somehow like something got lost in the translation.
Right.
So like it took a while for her nervous system to like calm down. But
Sure.
in his books, like you kind of start to learn that the nervous system is very intelligent and it will do what's needed to protect the you know, the animal, it'll to protect the human body.
Right.
And that can be at odds with what you consciously want.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
Which is really hard because you're having
Right.
these reactions and you're like, I don't want to be having these reactions, but they're here because
Yeah.
those parts, like that trauma, is kind of like trapped energy. It becomes like frozen in the past.
Sure.
And then it becomes hypervigilant and is focused on that not happening again. So it becomes very protective. Like, let's keep that from happening.
At all
But
costs.
but like whatever you focus on, you tend to like create. So then you get into like the self-fulfilling prophecy,
Repetition cycles.
repetition compulsion. But it's like we're so powerful. Actually, we have such potential to be such powerful creators that we can even create our own victimization cycles and have them become self-confirming.
Okay.
To be like, oh, I knew it was going to happen, and see, it happened.
Right.
So we're in our own loop of that, bias that's coming from our own trauma. And so it's like, how do you escape that?
Okay. So we talked a little bit about the insecure, anxious attachment, being over your skis, so to speak, in boundary violation, leaning in. Okay. So on the flip side, the boundaries, how boundaries work for, say, or it's not even predominantly, somebody who just happens to be triggered in a way that activates a avoidance style, right?
Yeah. And I'm kind of like in my brain thinking these are more like vanilla, normal, like reactions, like for a day-to-day person.
Sure.
Of course, like everyone, even like criminal offenders, like have nervous systems and then have different ways of, that of boundary violations. And anyway, I just started thinking about that, and it's like, wow, there's like a lot of different potentials out there. I would say that for the avoidant person, I'm trying to think of like what those boundary violations look like.
Well, I think it's just it's like, because avoidant people, whatever, and it gets into the mixture of avoidance and anxiousness, but sort of the typical vanilla puzzle piece together is that like an anxious person gets together with an avoidant person, right?
Yeah,
the
the
anxious person
avoidant
gets over their skis, right? And then
yeah.
in the boundary violation, they sort of get that sense of dismell, and then their safety seeking mechanism is just to get space, get away from this person. Here's my boundaries,
Yeah, let me self-soothe by myself, or find maybe a process addiction that feels like it's secure or reliable and can be work or substances, or
Right.
any process. Could be porn, could be cleaning, could be obsessively shopping, whatever, gambling. But finding that space. And I think some of how those boundary violations show up can be really sneaky. Like I would say avoidance are more likely to lie. Right. And in a way, like that's kind of a violation of sorts.
Right.
But it's like almost a different flavor from how the anxious shows up, because the anxious is going to be kind of these like moving forward and sort of transgressing in that way. But the avoidant person, like their boundary stuff is going to seem a lot more like subtle. Like it's going to maybe be more addiction related, where it's like lying or manipulating. But I've seen both anxious and avoidant types have some like caretaking or fawning tendencies, but they come from different places. So an anxious person that's caretaking can be like, see, like, don't abandon me, I'm needed, right? I'm needed. But an avoidant person can also caretake to avoid an emotional reaction. right? So they'll be like, I'll take care of
Yeah.
your feelings, I'll do the tap dance, I'll do whatever you want just so you don't explode on me emotionally. And that will be
Right.
overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
So you have to think about the intention behind each of those things and how the nervous system seeks safety because
Yeah.
it's all an energetic dance, just moving,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Like, right, where's
Yes.
the sweet spot? How do I feel
Right.
okay? How do I feel safe?
What do you think about? This is stuff we talked about in previous podcasts. So it's like I think about the uh, projection, boundaries and projection, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So this is just a projection is perceiving a boundary, right? But falsely, maybe
Wait, what are you? I'm trying to get clarity on what you're saying.
is projection, right?
Hmm.
The perception of a false boundary, like you have done this to me, when
I don't know if I would word it that way. I would say like projection or transference can be more of like projection can be literally that you have stuff inside that you don't want to own. And so you see other people as doing that, or you like one really common example is like the spouse that feels really guilty about cheating or wanting to cheat. And then
okay,
suddenly they become very jealous and they're like accusing their partner of cheating, of like doing the same thing that they're doing. But projection can also just come from blind spots where it's like you see like your shadow aspects or these wounded parts can see things that maybe it could never have done, like things that you could never have done and gotten away with or been okay with. So it's like that's not okay. And then anytime you see someone else doing that, it's gonna kind of push up against your own inner boundaries or limits to
right,
be like, I don't like that person. I don't like what they're doing, but here's why it's because it doesn't feel safe to you.
all
But
right,
instead of being able to see it within yourself, you see it clearly in
yeah,
them. And then you're safe to judge them and say, what a fucking asshole.
okay. So I feel like there is a boundary involved there, right? But God, that's a little tricky because that is it's like
It
it's like
is tricky. So I would, right. I would say it this way. I would say that when it comes to insecure attachment styles, if a person is trying to initiate a secure or healthy boundary, that's like just saying, this is what I want as a boundary. An insecure person, if that is going to interrupt their own, I don't say insecure person, but person that is exhibiting insecure attachment styles,
okay,
if that is interrupting the natural flow of what they need to seek safety. So if you set a distance boundary with an anxious person,
okay,
it's going to trigger their rejection or abandonment stuff.
yeah,
And so likely the way that they're going to perceive you as being rejecting or punishing, or there's just like a million things. They'll think you're playing games with them, you're fucking with them, you
right,
hate them, you're trying to drop them. So they're trying to establish safety, but their normal way of doing so that has normally involved unhealthy boundaries, lack of boundaries, enmeshment, transgressing, like there really being no checks and balances when and the boundaries. So we need to talk about the different types of boundaries, the categories and the types of boundaries, but this can be more like porous boundaries, meaning there's really not a lot of like structure in
mm,
place. And so basically, it's just they're used to that. And so if you do something that's any flavor of more rigid or harsh, and like being too rigid isn't healthy, being too porous isn't healthy, right? You
right,
want this like healthy flexibility where
mm-hmm,
you're able to have compassion for that person. You're kind of able to like talk about things and come up with something that maybe feels good for both of you that perhaps doesn't involve compromise if it doesn't need to, because sometimes there's just going to be certain non-negotiables, right? But to that person that's not used to healthy boundaries, it's going to feel very confronting, likely very triggering, making them feel out of control because you are blocking access. you're changing up the rules of like I can't think of the word right now, but the rules of just their connection, like how they're used to getting love. So the tricky thing about setting boundaries, if you're a person who's been healing through codependent behaviors and healing through your attachment stuff, is likely the people in your life, your family, like your nervous systems are all at a similar set point, like attracts like.
Yes.
So when you start to change and erect healthy boundaries, it's going to feel like a shock to that system that didn't know healthy boundaries. And it may feel like you're being cold, you're being harsh, you're being a bitch, you're being a dick. It's like, wow, you don't care.
Yeah.
Because there's an interesting flavor of and Brene Brown like talks about this. She talks about like empathy. And if you are totally swallowed by empathy, then you are literally taking on someone else's pain. But when you do that, you're actually really not able to help them. But when you have compassion for where they're at, then it's like you're on a rung higher in the ladder and you're actually able to reach a hand down and be like, I feel you, but I'm not necessarily going to, like if you've ever read that story, The Benefits of Struggling, about the man that like clips the cocoon for the butterfly. It's like, I'm not going to enable you or like pick you up and carry you around, but I can extend compassion to you as you do your thing and like struggle however, it's necessary. Like I can extend compassion to you, but I can also do that in a firm and boundaried place that will benefit both of us, even if it feels really awkward and uncomfortable at first. And so the tricky thing about this is like when a person is coming from a very codependent, trauma filled, like insecure paradigm or like group of people or friends, when you start to heal, it's like you start to be able to see things that you can't unsee.
Yeah.
And then those people, if they haven't been doing the work, they're not going to understand that what you're doing is healthy. And it can be really, really hard for them to understand that. And they may want to cut you down or pull you back into their dynamic because that's what their nervous system is comfortable doing. So it's like, if you love me, or if you don't want to be exiled from our tribe, like you're going to fit in and do what we're doing. Because this is what we've always done.
Yeah.
But if you threaten that, then you have to think about, okay, what happens when animals like get into it and there's like a threat? You see the fangs come out, you see like the hairs raising on the back.
The
like there's
hierarchy needs to be reestablished. Yeah.
Right. So like, you've probably heard stories of people like trying to get out of the ghetto or these really entrenched like abusive situations, and like they keep getting pulled back, or they'll get so far and then they'll like go back, and but it can be very confronting because it's like the people that you love, the people that you were connected with, it can be like embarking on a journey on your own and kind of traveling through the desert where for a while you may not have like a bunch of healthy friends as you're learning what healthy boundaries or healthy relationships feel like. And then it's like the people that you thought would love and support you are threatened by the fact that you're leaving, but also threatened by the fact that they used to be able to rely on you being a certain way so that they could get their needs met. That wasn't confronting to them, but now you are interrupting that pattern, and they don't like it, and they will fight you, and they will pull out all the stops to call you names, fling poo at you, like, well, that's more like from the animal kingdom, but humans do it sometimes too. But whatever it takes, emotional manipulation, martyrdom, whatever they need to do to get you back and doing what it is that they want you to do, they're going to do. But it's largely from an unconscious place. Like it's usually not conscious manipulation, but yeah.
So I think about examples of when boundaries got changed in relationships I've had. It's usually the most stark ones are like intimate relationships, like I had one particular a friend of mine now that we dated sort of for a while, you know, for like a few months or maybe a year or something, and then that relationship didn't work out, and I don't know, like when we sort of decided we were going to be friends, or like we were still communicating, and then like her boundary was like, no, I need to reestablish something, so I'm going to not talk to you, right? And about how just so it's like, so there's this boundary, and then somebody sort of like changes it, you know, about how just for me personally, it was very disconcerting for a lot of different reasons for me personally. But I think about just changing boundaries at all, I just think that there's a certain feeling to it, right? And
Yeah.
like one of the things that you talked about before was like, which I think I'm sure that we have mentioned, is this idea of like expanding your own nervous system, you know, especially if you're trying to create, like craft something new. You know, we're all so creatures of habit. Then if we want to build something new, it's like it's going to take a lot of sort of concerted
Yeah.
work over time, right? And it's very easy. And in fact, it's bound to happen that you will collapse back into the normal, or just the road
Yeah,
more traveled.
you're bound to have like a relapse or go back
Yes,
down that familiar neural
right,
pathway with the same behaviors, which
right. So
every addict knows like
yeah,
that, you know?
it's and the best thing that anybody can do is not condemn themselves. Just have a commitment to what they want their new boundary to be, right? Which means I'm picking myself up and I'm going back to it, right? Just knowing like the condemnation is a lot of energy, sort of like misplaced and misspent.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's just like, just understand that like we are creatures of habit. More than likely, you know, try as you might, and maybe you get it right on the first time, you know, and you can make a change. But
Hmm.
I just think it's so fundamental. That's why we get all these kind of weird, not weird, but strong reactions. You can get very strong reactions depending on the boundary you're setting and how it's going to interact with other people's nervous systems and to their own set point,
Right.
and about how important you being where you are makes up their own being, right? Because that's the interdependency that is like so understated in how we live as social animals, you know, that it's like
Yeah, like you
I
don't want
depend
to
on you
be
to be a certain type of person. And, you know, after a while, after you hang out with somebody for a while, you have all your set points of how you actually act. And so when you sense something new, it really is, the whole system has to like readjust then. And people do not like change, you know,
right.
they
And
like things.
it's like you don't want to be ostracized from society or that social contract by
Right,
like bucking the system, or you know, like
right,
Romeo who was banished.
right,
And it's interesting because what can happen, you know, unintentionally is when you start to set boundaries, is like you can trigger other people with your boundaries and you can trigger their shame. Like, oh, I
yeah,
did something wrong. That's why you're doing this to me. So it can feel
right,
like retaliation or
yes,
punishment. And it's really touching those deep things. And it's the interesting thing about boundaries, it's like each person gets to decide like what their limit is and
hmm,
express that to another person, and then that other person, like both people get to decide whether they want to continue the relationship by opting in based on the fact that these boundaries are here. And it's like you get to decide if you're okay with that, like if you want to continue to like operate with this person given that they have a specific boundary around this. Do you want to honor that? Well, if you want to be in a relationship, that you need to honor and respect those boundaries.
hmm,
And then if you don't, then you decide like, well, this isn't going to work for me.
right,
And there's no shame around that. But another interesting thing to note is there can be internal and external boundaries. Like you can set internal
hmm,
boundaries for yourself that can also be very challenging and triggering,
sure,
especially when you are setting new habits. Um, and you and I talk about internal family systems a lot, but you can have these like sub personalities or aspects of yourself that have trauma. And when you're trying to like create a new behavior or you know, establish like a newer, healthier habit, you're going to have a part of you that was relying on that substance or that routine or that ritual.
hmm,
And when you start to break that up, you're actually changing your body's entire chemistry. So it's not just like your neural wiring, but it's your entire nervous system. And so it's like learning to give yourself grace around taking time to let those new things, those new behaviors like solidify, but also like have some compassion for yourself because like those parts are just like, they're people, they're younger versions of you that don't have full perspective and have had these coping mechanisms and things going on for a reason.
Right.
So it's like, how can you be kind when setting internal boundaries, and how can you try to be kind as well, like when setting external boundaries?
What's an example of an internal boundary?
I mean, I would just say it could be something like being in bed by 11 p.m. can be an internal boundary.
Okay.
Right? It can be like, I don't eat brownies on Wednesdays. Like, what?
I think about one when I thought about it. I was like, I tried. I have tried to
Mm-hmm.
not directly talk shit about myself. Right.
Yeah,
Like sit there
that's
and
a
cuss
boundary
myself. Yeah.
because that's a boundary with, I think, a higher part of yourself, or maybe a protector, like a parental part, and
Right.
like another part that has, in its own way, been trying to protect you by thinking that if it motivates you through shame, by
Yeah.
talking shit and cutting you down, that you'll try harder.
Right.
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 But it's like, re-educating that part to say this isn't productive, let's try something new, and in doing that you can actually change your neural wiring.
Right.
um
And then an example of an external boundary.
I mean, external boundary is, I don't like being touched like that.
Okay.
Like,
Cool.
I'm not a hugger. Like, I would like you to ask permission if you're going to hug me.
Sure.
That
You
could be a
mentioned
boundary.
you mentioned earlier about
I
different
am a hugger, by
types.
the way,
Oh.
just so you know. No, it depends, like sometimes, like, but usually when I meet people and we talk,
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
they want to hug me and I'm like, girl, we're hug.
You mentioned different types of boundaries. So was that internal, external, or was there other categories?
Yeah, there's other, um yeah, there's other categories.
What are some of those?
So other characteristics, I guess, of boundaries.
Sure.
One other thing I was going to say, and then it sort of flew out of my brain. What was it? Maybe I'll come back to it. So I remember the boundaries as PMS, EFS.
PMS.
PMS, which is easy to remember, and EFS. So physical, mental,
PMS. EMS.
PMS, EFS.
FS. Okay.
Yeah. So
Physical. Okay.
P stands for physical. So that would be my own person. That would mean
Right.
you don't hit me.
Right. You don't
And
touch
if
me
you
like
do,
that.
then there's,
Yeah.
you don't touch me like that.
Okay.
I don't
M.
like that. And also, I don't put myself in relationships where people hit me.
Oh.
Okay. So you
Okay.
could kind of see it as both ways. Like, I have an
Sure.
internal boundary, right?
Hmm.
Mental or intellectual. So that means that my thoughts and ideas are respected, that that I respect my own by sharing them and voicing them. And then also that I don't put myself in relationships with people that put my ideas and thoughts and opinions down.
Okay.
And then we would have
S.
sexual.
Okay.
Okay. Like, I don't want sex right now. Maybe later. Maybe you can convince me by blowing in my ear. Like, I will allow that. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I don't like that kind of touch, or I'm not wanting it right now. And oh, that was the other thing I was going to say, is that your boundaries can actually change in the moment based on the
Sure.
relationship, based on how comfortable you feel. And
Right.
so that's something that we talked about in the last podcast about being in attunement, like being attuned to yourself, sharing that with someone else, like intimacy in a way, like,
Right.
this is what's going on with me, my deeper why at this moment I'm not ready for this, or I don't want this, like the why being very important, communicating that. And
Okay.
then
E.
yes, E is emotional. So that
Emotional.
means having your emotions honored. So if you're expressing emotionally, like maybe someone's saying it's not okay for you to um insult my emotions or make fun of me when I'm having
Sure.
emotions, or it's like how you approach your own emotions as well. So that could be like, I hold space for my emotions. I validate and reassure
Okay.
myself. So I don't put myself in relationships with people that don't validate or
Yeah.
try to tell me I'm not feeling how I feel, or,
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
F.
F would be financial. A lot of people
Finance.
don't always think about that, but people can financially betray your boundaries. And
Right.
that means maybe like going out to eat and your friend insists that you split the check, but they order five things and you order one.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, it's important that you safeguard your own boundaries and speak up for yourself and talk about what you're willing to do and what you aren't willing to do, and
Yeah.
don't let people rush you and say, like other examples of bad financial boundaries can be like, oh, I just always pay my mom's electricity bill, but maybe your mom is like to the casinos and like blowing all of her money,
Yeah.
and then you're
Right.
becoming resentful. So
Yeah.
it's like making sure that's something that you want to do, but also consider where the motivation for that is coming from.
Mm-hmm. And S.
The other S is spiritual. So that's just about honoring, I think, which, can be a little bit of a crossover from like thoughts and opinions, but I think it's someone's freedom to practice their own sense of like spirituality or religion, and respecting how they connect to themselves and the divine and source, however you see that, and respecting their right to worship in a way.
Sure.
So that could kind of bleed over into some of the other categories.
Okay, so
Um,
I made notes on all of these, right? And one of the words that came up all over and over and over was respect and like attunement.
yeah,
So it's like if you are just attuned to somebody really
yeah,
well,
yeah. You'll know
boundaries
what
like
they value, and you'll also see when they're like, oh,
yeah,
thinking about something, or you can tell when someone's like not comfortable or they're not sure yet if they're comfortable.
right,
So if you're paying attention and you're present, you'll learn a lot from just watching another person
right.
take something in, or even watching them like watch a movie, what they like and what they don't like, or
Okay. So I think, and
yeah.
this goes both ways. So it's like if I want to get along with you, if I'm, well, we'll just say like I don't think it has to be like a laser, right? I almost think has to be like driving a car. Like you need to be awake, you need to be focused, you need to have your hands on the steering wheels and like have all your inputs, but then relaxed, you know. Let
Mhm.
the information come to you. Don't have like a like a spotlight pointed out, like it's like, okay, I'm watching everything you're doing under a microscope.
You're
So
making me
it's
think of the
I'm crushing you. I'm
I'm
crushing you.
scratching your head.
So okay, outward is going to get so much is going to cover all the respect, and then you're going to move with the flow of the energy, whatever it happens to be. So physical, mental, emotional, financial, spiritual, all those things can be
Yeah.
reacted to, and then you take that attunement
Mhm. Yes.
and you bring it into yourself.
That's right. That respect and attunement, those inner standards and values, and really treating yourself with care and with respect. And those physical boundaries can also pertain to personal property, like your stuff, right? Because that's an extension of you,
Sure. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And also like how you
Well,
treat
sorry, I
your
smashed all your shit. Well, it wasn't you.
right, or also like how you treat your physical body. So a physical boundary can also be, about the very heated vaccine debate, right? Whether or not it's okay to put things into my body, whether I consent, right? So, really like contentious topics around our own like body sovereignty and things like that. And it's like, do people have a right to their boundaries? And then you get into some gray area stuff and get
Not
into
if they say
survival
otherwise on
stuff.
the TV.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Depends,
If
right?
the TV
So,
says it, it goes. TV's God,
yeah.
and we respect the television.
Um, you're making me laugh. Yeah. Oh, and then the other qualities I was going to talk about with boundaries is there can be like almost like no boundaries. So you would have like a state of enmeshment where it's like, I don't know where I end and you begin. And it's like, there's really no boundaries,
Right.
kind of is the agreement. So it's like, as long as you don't have boundaries, like we're cool. Like I can do whatever I want to you, you can do whatever you want to me. Right. In a way,
Yeah,
like
I
you're
mean,
responsible for my emotions. I'm responsible for yours. I don't know who's what, whose
wow.
is what. And like, that's this like chaos that we exist
Sounds
in,
kind of
which
messy.
it is pretty messy, and emotionally very messy as well. And then lots of like victimization and blame and anger and resentment show up there. And a lot of this is like kind of that codependent relationship place. Um, but that would be more like spongy or like passive boundaries, like not really, like not firm. And then you get into, or maybe spongy is the one in the middle. Spongy, no, because there's like healthy boundaries. Spongy might, damn it, no, I'm forgetting. I like did a post on this. And then there's like rigid. So it's kind of like
Sure.
super porous. Oh, I think spongy might be the one where it's like porous but then rigid. So it's kind of like almost no boundaries and then like super rigid. So it's like, right? And I
Yeah.
would say that's probably more of a like disorganized attachment style, it feels like. And then there can
Yeah.
be like super rigid, but it just kind of depends on the topic or the person, or I think that these can show up in a lot of different ways. So there's
Yeah.
just like certain qualities of boundaries, and ideally we don't want it to be so porous that just everything's getting through. Like these emotional and intellectual boundaries can also mean like if you're just letting everything in, then if a person says, like if I'm like, you're a bad person, Nick, you're bad.
And then it's like,
But if you, right, if you know the truth of who you are, and if you know the truth of who you are and you're connected to your higher self, you're
right.
going to like have like a little mesh kind of thing up, and you're going to like catch that, and you're going to be like, let me think about it. Am I?
Right. Well,
Does that fit? Am I
it
just
goes.
going to let that in?
It goes like if I call it, you're a purple buffalo, and you're like, huh?
Right. Right. Yeah.
I mean, like whatever. It's like you don't even have to like, you don't have to do any processing about that because you know something else, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think Dr. Gabor Mate, and I think it's in the Wisdom of Trauma documentary, where it like shows him talking to a woman and she's like so upset over something that one of her partners said. And then he said something like, if they said you had purple like worms in your hair or something, you should be like, what? And he's like, exactly. So if we don't have like a clear idea of who we are, if we don't see ourselves clearly, we might just let everyone else define who we are and just let everything in. So there's really no boundary there. There's no
I
there's
also
no
think
healthy structure.
well, I think it's also healthy to understand that we are social creatures, and so we
Yes.
are made
Yeah.
up of the perceptions and the consciousnesses of the people around us. This is why the company that you keep is so important, and
Yeah.
it's like I always thought about like the river that you're born in, like the stream of life. It's like you're only brought up to the consciousness level of the river around you about what you were raised in.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
unless you're like, in my case, divinely tortured, right? It like forces me to like find other avenues of consciousness and understanding to make sense of sort of what's happening.
Right.
But it's just to sort of like realize that we are social creatures, and that though we have boundaries, right? I'm not a purple buffalo, but Angela, when you say something to me, it affects me, right? It does,
Right. Yeah. It's like, I don't think we're ever going to be in a place where it's just like, you can say whatever you want. Like
right.
maybe if you're feeling super grounded in who you are and you're just like, maybe like very rooted in like that truth and like self-source place, that is just like everything kind of, that
Right.
I'm rubber, you're glue kind of thing. Like you just got that going on. Right. But
Yeah.
I think for a lot of us, it's like we don't necessarily want to be so porous that we let people tell us who we are and what to think and everything. So we want to
Right.
have healthy boundaries where it's like a screen. We let stuff in, we're letting some stuff in, keeping other things out, but being able to discern. But we also don't want to be so rigid that we never take any feedback or we never listen to anyone like
Right.
we don't take compliments, or we just shut
Yeah.
everything out. So
Yeah.
it's like
Right.
you want that
And I think that like
balanced
you
place.
can notice these things just by the hallmark of the energy that's around them, So it's getting back to the whole, what does creativity actually feel like, right?
Mhm.
And what comes from that place? It's like, obviously, like, if you're strapped to some shame moment or shame energy, or just like this battle that you're in, that sort of dictates certain
Yeah.
influences that are happening. Whereas if you're like very connected in self and open and like flowing with the river of life, that you can reflect back, and share with people and be creative and have that creative juices flowing and that spark flowing, and that can be really healthy and really good for the whole system of the people that you're in.
Mhm.
Like a deep sharing with people that you
Yeah.
care about. If you can be in these like attuned and respected places, but also shared deeply about how you feel and like what kind of inspiration or things that come up inside you and things.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
like boundaries really are about us knowing our own limits,
Hmm.
what we can take on energetically, physically, all those things, even financially. It's like finding that sweet spot. I think that growth edge without throwing yourself into overwhelm, not putting too much stress on your own system, but also not letting others, stress you out by letting them pull on you, and vice versa, and not pulling on others so much. So it is about finding that place of
That
healthy
place.
that place, the patos, um, that place of healthy interdependence. And it's like boundaries can be about like our values and standards, like what it is that
Mm-hmm.
we'll accept, what it is that we want, and also protecting our inner and outer resources. So
Mm-hmm.
it's important. It's really, boundaries are super important. And I think that boundaries should be reciprocal, just like relationships. It's like if we really care about, I think naturally, if we have a lot of compassion and care for ourselves, that's going to flow over
Mm-hmm.
into other people and caring. Like, and we talked about this in the last podcast about the sexual boundaries, but it's
I don't
like,
think that was the last podcast, just so you know.
what was the last podcast?
It
Is there
was,
another one in between? Oh, you're right. It was avoidant. Yeah, it was
yeah,
all about avoidant attachment. It was two ago. You're right. But it's like something
yeah.
that I feel like is really important. It's like in life, in relationships, it's like I'm having a good time. Like I want you to have a good time too. Like I want my partner to share like what's up with them. Like I don't want someone suffering while I'm over here like, wee.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I think we really need to check ourselves and be like, am I in a place where I'm giving generously, like that I want to give this? Because if not, it's like you're violating your own boundary and then getting angry at the other person for it. And that other person might just be thinking you're giving without strings attached or whatever if there's been no conversation. And then all that resentment builds up. And then maybe that other person starts cheating on you because you're like, you're just a taker, you're a piece of shit. But it's like, you were just giving me all this stuff. But I do think that there's some like attunement and things in there.
Oh yeah.
But it's about sharing your own vulnerabilities and limitations with that other person to say, I'm like, I actually don't like this. Doesn't feel good for me. This would feel better, or I'm gonna go do this. And I remember years ago having a situation come up where I was on a specific diet. Just at the time, I was having like body pain, so I had a very like clean diet, like mostly vegetables, a little bit of meat, and I had few options to choose from. So when I found a place, I'm like, cool, a healthy place, simple, I can go in and order. And one of the friends that I was with, I told her I need to eat dinner now. Like I'm like not feeling well. I need to eat. And she wanted to go to this like bar with some people that we had met. And I said, it's okay, like go ahead, I'll stay here. And she got so mad at me for wanting to stay. And I think she might still be angry at me today, but it's like I have my own needs that I needed to have my own back in that moment and say, I'm protecting my own resources. I'm valuing and listening to myself. I'm deeply attuned to myself. And my own responsibility is to myself first. Put your oxygen mask on first before you put other people's on. And so I invited her to stay and eat with me. I invited the other people. I'm like, y'all can eat with me. We'll go over together. But she was very angry about me not self abandoning and betraying myself to go do that. And it may seem like a small thing, but it's really not. It's not a small thing. And when people are not used to healthy boundaries, when they're used to lack of boundaries and enmeshment, then they can really see you as, like, in their opinion, they'll see you as being very selfish, very cruel, not caring. And it's like, that may not really be the case. It may be that this person actually knows what healthy boundaries are, and perhaps what you've been used to has been unhealthy. And you have to think about like both sides of it. If I'm dishing this out, do I also want to receive this? If I'm the person that needs to eat, do I want someone pulling on my energy to go do this thing with them, to get upset about me meeting my own needs or feeling comfortable?
Right.
And I think the answer is no, but I do know oftentimes in cases of victimization, it can be really hard to see another person's perspective, because
for sure,
our wounds very much narrow our lens of perception into threat and adversarial relationships. And then everyone's an enemy and everything's a threat, and we're being triggered and the world is not safe.
Right. That was a situation like that, scenario like that is sort of what I was talking about earlier, when it was like about taking responsibility for, when boundaries are interacted, or when you have to do it yourself,
Yeah, and it can be really, really tricky to set boundaries based on your nervous system and what your neural expectation or neuroception is, which it just means, what does your nervous system expect will happen when you try to set a boundary?
Right.
So in the past, as a child, if you try to say, no, I don't want to be in your damn picture, mom, and then you get spanked and like shoved in the picture,
in
like,
trouble.
right? You get in that picture. Then it's like your nervous system anticipates that if you try to set a boundary, you're going to be assaulted, and then you're going to be thrown in. You have to do what you don't want to do anyway. So then it's like, why set the boundary?
Right.
Or it may be that your nervous system gets into a place where you become extremely reactive. When you go to set a boundary, and if someone like kind of, wiggles, tries to, talk you out of it or compromise or even have a conversation, you might go into a really reactive place. So anytime you find yourself in an extreme place of reaction or repression, so if you're like, the way that you're reacting is like out of context to the situation, like it's very heightened, like so much rage, so much reaction, so much wanting to punch people in the face and like Bruce Lee them or whatever, or noticing that you're just like, I just want to give up. I don't want to rock the boat or whatever. Yeah. Then what you're looking at is a traumatized nervous system that's really seeking safety and some disconfirming evidence that you can actually have a good time setting boundaries, that you can successfully set healthy boundaries. But it's a practice, it's not a perfect. So at first it's like really messy when you need to start setting boundaries. And I would say setting boundaries, the process of it, and you can talk this through with me, but I would say it's really identifying knowing when you need to set a boundary. Like the realization, like there has to be awareness around needing to set a boundary. So let's say, for example, you have a mother that just likes to show up at your place unannounced, right? Which I kind of feel like mothers like to do. They just like to be like, I'll just stop by, right? And in their mind, it's like, I'll just, it's innocuous. But let's say your nervous system is like, I need my guests to announce themselves. If someone's going to come over, like, please ask my permission. Like, I want to expect you. I want to be prepared for you. So if you have that happen in the moment, if you're able to feel into that trigger or that feeling of like, oh, I'm not comfortable, I don't like this, this is what I really want. When you know what you want, then you can share that in the moment without being reactive. You can just state the boundary. This is what I would like. And actually, I was talking about this with my coach recently, but she says Allison Armstrong has an acronym for boundaries, which is AID, AID. And the first thing is ask. So, like, ask for your boundary, like, say, I would like this, and then insist, and then demand. So, you move into insist. It's like, I insist, right? Because usually it takes more than one attempt for another person's nervous system to kind of get it or acclimate. It just depends on the situation.
Right.
So, knowing that it takes us time to change our behaviors and habits, we can also expect that other people's nervous systems will take some time to acclimate or change. So it's like giving them grace as well, but not necessarily like putting up with people's shit, but being in a place of gently reminding. And that just depends on the boundary, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And then when you demand, I think it's more like, okay, this is happening, and then these are the consequences. So now that I've asked and then I've reminded, and now I'm like demanding that this boundary be met, like this is a non-negotiable for me, then I have to state what the consequences of violating my boundaries are. And then I have to follow through with the consequences. So that means that maybe that means we're not in a relationship anymore. Maybe that means you're not allowed to come by my house at all. Who knows what it means? Like, it just depends on what your consequences are. But you need to follow through on your consequences. And you actually need to verbally state your boundaries and make sure they're clearly communicated, understood, that the other person has received it. And like, they may or may not be willing to respect those boundaries, but you can figure it out, like what the path forward is there. And then you remind, you whatever. And at some point you're like, however many tries this person gets, they get. And then at some point you're done and you're like, I've done all the things I've said, I've requested, I've done all the things.
I think you're missing a big part of this sequence, though.
What?
Where you lay down your boundary, do you tell somebody, and then you have the like internal like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. You know,
oh, you mean
recoil.
Like, oh, you're saying like if we were to like talk about like potential things that could come up when doing it, like doing the boundary. Yeah. And like, especially with fearful avoidant types, I don't know if we went into the disorganized, but disorganized type would have both potential boundary things. So fearful avoidant is also like disorganized with, I would just say, usually an added flavor of a expectation of bodily harm or physical intimidation, like an extra layer of being physically harmed in some way, or maybe sexually assaulted or whatever. But yeah, so sometimes if setting boundaries has never been safe for you, or you avoid confrontation, then your nervous system you may be triggered by you like actually setting a boundary and standing in the fear of that.
Big time.
And so for those people, for my fearful avoidant or disorganized people that anticipate backlash, what's really important for you is to, I would say, like, walk through your steps with a coach about what you need to feel safe in order to set those boundaries and follow through. Do you need to have a friend with you as you set those boundaries? Do you need to stand behind a piece of furniture? Do you need to do what I call like masking, or I forget what the other term is.
Face to face, mano a mano, and send them an email.
Right. Armoring. Yeah. Like, do you need to set a boundary when you're not in physical proximity? So it's, or like, do you need to set a boundary while face to face? So it's just like, it's important, I think, to run through those scenarios with a friend, with a coach, with your therapist, and really talk about like how to set those boundaries, how to stretch past the expectations of your nervous system into the unknown and feeling safe at the same time. So it's like, what kind of support do you need?
Yeah. I always thought it was interesting to sort of like witness myself like in person, on the phone, via text. You know, you would get different versions of me, like drastically different versions, you know?
Yeah.
And it was just like, it's like, oh, okay. Just being so completely averse to.
Right. Well, it's funny because like in this whole like ghosting culture, when people like break up with someone over text or over the phone, it's like they have a nervous system set point and they're trying to avoid emotional backlash. And so they're going to do the thing that they think will be the least confrontational, because to their nervous system, confrontation is not safe. They were like, I would rather do anything else than to have a confrontation.
Yeah.
But to confront just means to face towards or turn towards someone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I remember hearing stories about this guy I listened to on the radio that he confronted people, like he would confront people in grocery stores who had like obviously bad behavior, you know, and just even listening to the story, it's like, oh, you know.
right. Yeah. It kind of
Where it
makes
was like for him, he was just like, you know, it was just obvious. He just had to do it, you know, and it was just like totally matter of fact. And it was like, I always kind of like that. I was like, oh man, there's something like really like really beautiful in that of just like reacting to somebody's like really bad behavior in public, you know.
Yeah, but it is interesting just to like notice your own fear around confrontation, like rocking the boat and like disagreeing with someone or setting boundaries, because if you have a problem with that, you're going to have a problem showing up authentically in relationships. And then you're going to hide yourself or lower your standards or values and really not share what's going on with you. And then all of a sudden, it's like your relationship it's like living a lie, because there isn't any authentic truth or vulnerability or intimacy actually happening. And so like boundaries are so important to all of these things. It's like knowing what you need and learning how to express that, but also learning how to find safety as you express it. And like, don't force yourself into like getting it right or like doing it all the way. Like you can set incremental boundaries. You can be like, I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to work towards this boundary, you know? And it's really honestly like that first step is just having an awareness that there needs to be a boundary.
Right.
And
I like, I think about also having a commitment towards something, right? So if you know that you're averse to confrontation, right? It's just like, if you have some kind of knowing or that you want to like aspire in a certain direction, it's like, okay, this is going to be a difficult challenge for me, you know? And so number one, not beating yourself up when you avoid, right? Or like you see an opportunity.
It's normal.
Like you're like, God, I wish I would have said that thing, you know? And it's like, it's like, okay, that's fine, you know? Coming around to something more authentic to who you are, like, takes practice. You have to stretch your whole being into that. And so it's just like stick with the commitment and then just try to reaffirm it, you know, like, you know, maybe like have a mantra or have something you write down. It's like recommitting yourself to a thing, especially in these deeply held, right, things that we learned in our very formation of being human beings, you know. That's like how deep some of this shit is, you know. So about we are swimming upstream, but we have the ability to do it. We do.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say something and then I forgot it. It went blank.
Anyway, we're pretty deep into this. I think we should wrap up.
Yeah. It was good though. What I was gonna say was really good.
Well, you have the floor.
What were you saying again? I think it was something about, oh yeah. It was this. It was noticing like how, like what environment you were raised in is likely going to dictate, because, you know, we talked about trauma, like kind of dictating the state of the nervous system as well as your natural like drives for finding safety and what that looks like, right?
Yeah.
So if you grew up in a household that had very rigid boundaries, as an adult, you may find yourself like with a very like authoritarian, like dictatorship like rules. You may find yourself all the way in like spongy boundary land where you don't really, you're like, oh, it's okay, it's all right, like more of, you know, doormat. And it's like both ends of that extreme are unhealthy, because one is too rigid. It's like there's no attunement, there's no care or compassion for what's going on. And if you're too spongy, then it's like there's almost no boundaries. And those that grow up in homes with lack of boundaries or lack of structure can really suffer when it comes to like focusing or getting things done. And then they can also, you can find either either type can rebel from structure or rebel from boundaries or rebel around commitments or anything that feels too constraining. So oftentimes when we've experienced a certain kind of trauma or suffering around one type of boundary or style of parenting, or if you have both, and you might bounce back between unhealthy parenting styles. And it's really important to notice when you're not in harmony, because the goal is to really come into balance and find that sweet spot of like structure and healthy boundaries, as well as time for like flow and free time and play. So we need both if we're going to be healthy. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I felt like it was important. Maybe that'll be like a like mind-blowing moment for someone. Like, oh my God, thank God she said that. Changed my life.
Cool.
Yeah, but I feel good about that. Is there anything else you would add?
No. Sounds good. I like it.
Right.
Boundaries. September 13th, year of our Lord, 2022. Record date. We're also going to post it. I'm going to post it here in like 10 minutes.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, thanks for your comments. I've started to see like people have started to comment. We love your comments. We love having feedback. You can also find us on Instagram at the So Emotional Podcast. And we love feedback. We love ideas. So if you have ideas for podcasts, and if you would like to give the podcast a rating, that would be great. Happy to receive your support, and also let us know how we can serve you, because that's why we're here. Amen. And you can find me at Epic Initiator. You can find Nick at The Safe Anchor. He's starting to do stuff there. It might be under construction a little, but
cool. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Nick.
All right. So emotional.
Out.